Energy Vista, a podcast on timely energy issues, personal and professional trajectories. I'm your host, Leslie Palti-Guzman. It's June 18, 2025, and time for a new Energy Vista episode. Today I'm exchanging with Rachel Ziemba, the founder of Diamba Insights, a macro advisory firm with a special focus on emerging markets and energy issues. And if you haven't heard Rachel talking, she's everywhere over the past few weeks to discuss about the Iran-Israel war that we will discuss on this podcast too. And she's also associated with NYU and in many other places. Hi, Rachel.
Hi, Leslie. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on short notice. I felt that it was important to have our voice out and contribute to the public debate about this very timely and important development with a war in the Middle East between Israel and Iran. So we are now in the sixth day of the Operation Rising Lion, the military operation that Israel launched against Iran in an effort to prevent another nuclear power. And in Israel words, it's also to basically strike the head of the octopus of terror. So for me, the war started really on October 7th, when Iranian-backed Hamas carried out surprise attack on Israel. And since then, Israel has been going systematically after each of Iran's proxies. The Hezbollah, the Hamas, all have been weakened, decapitated within their leadership, and we've seen a deployment of spy craft that basically we had only seen in movies so far. But recently, so for the past 6 days, it feels different. We have really, exchange of fires with casualties on both sides, infrastructure casualties. There has been some energy infrastructure destroyed. And we don't know how far Israel is willing to go. We don't know yet if the US will join the fight. And we don't know what Iran will choose to do, ultimately, and how it responds. So I'm very happy you're joining me today, because I think both together we can unpack a lot on these developments and think about the different scenarios and what it means for each of them, maybe in terms of energy trade and infrastructure risk. And to start, do you think we're talking a lot about risk of escalation, but without really defining what escalation means? And, since October 7th, and even with the war between Russia and Ukraine, escalation has always been like the big fear, like not to give too many weapons by fear of retaliation, not to to go slow rather than decisive. So where do you think we're standing right now within the Trump administration, and also like the neighbors of Israel in the region and in the Gulf? Like, is it like the retaliation and the escalation? Is it a real perceived threat? And is the oil market, for instance, in a better place today to basically resist such impact?
Yeah, well, I guess it depends where you end up on the escalatory ladder, whether the sort of oil market is ready. Yeah, and I take your point. I think you're right. I think what's happening now really takes its time back to October 7th or even earlier, but this is a new phase, right? Israel going after nuclear, sort of certain nuclear facilities, really sort of removing a set of military and nuclear leadership that has been quite quickly replaced, right? And I think, unlike with some of Iran's friends in the region, where maybe they were sort of non-state actors or smaller entities, not a full country, I think we're seeing a little bit of the infrastructure of Iran, the size of its economy, and how it's responding. But, I do think we're seeing a dynamic that maybe hadn't been at play in past exchanges between Israel and Iran of missiles and the like. Right, and we saw at least two episodes, right, in the last year, that were sort of an escalation, but is sort of one off and done. There was a
Like more
desire
like
for
a tit for tat. Like you
exactly.
this one missiles, two missiles, like one night, two nights, and that's it. And but
Exactly, and not to underemphasize the danger to sort of individuals and the like, but this is a meaningful escalation. So yeah, where do we go from here? It's hard to know, but what I've been spending a lot of time is thinking about what are the signposts to watch that we're sort of escalating further. One of them is, as you say, more direct U.S. involvement. I tend to be of the opinion that the U.S. is already quite involved. I mean, they're not U.S. sort of troops and U.S. Facilities and vessels and the like involved, but the provision of military equipment to Israel, the involvement. I think that there's a line that hasn't been crossed yet, but there definitely is U.S. support of this of
yeah,
this
I,
mission.
I think when people think about involvement of the US, it's also basically going after Fordow, which is the
Yes,
facility which
yes.
is buried under a mountain. The you know the that would be the prize of the war. And I think that if Fordow was destroyed or you know taken away as a threat, it could be potentially for Israel, meaning reaching the goal of the current operation. That would be a decisive win because it will basically really give a signal that the nuclear program in Iran will be set back for, I don't know in terms of time, but at least for that would be exactly what they were looking for.
Yeah, I think that's definitely the sort of most positive, kind of spin on it. I know there's also a lot of questions that even with some of the U.S. military equipment, we won't know exactly how effective. Of course, it might be hard to know actually how much is destroyed, because if it's been difficult enough to get inspectors in the last few years, and Iran has been intransigent about that and was not moving quickly to a nuclear deal or the like, but to know in those dynamics. So yes, I think you're right that the question mark of escalation on the nuclear side, Fordo definitely, and the case in point. Also, I think the question mark we've been watching about what about political leadership, and I think Israel has been careful. I mean, who knows to what extent of Israeli choices versus U.S. negotiations versus others. The other thing I think we're all sort of watching is what about Iran's export oil, energy infrastructure. We've seen some damage to domestic facilities, though not the largest refineries that are used domestically, but the gas refinery,
So you're
and
referring
certain.
to South Pars 14.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes, yes. The
which
South,
is
the
which was interesting because it's the further away from Qatar, because Qatar
yes.
and Iran are sharing this field, and when you look at the geography of the
Mhm.
South
Yeah,
Pars and the 14th block, it's like the further away from Qatar. So
correct.
um,
Yeah,
I think they've been careful also in choosing the target, but it shows also that it's not out of the question that
exactly.
we could see some vulnerabilities and damage to the oil and gas infrastructure in Iran and in Qatar.
Hmm.
Could go bigger. But so to come back on the first scenario,
Yeah.
for me it's like total. It's what I call the total submission scenario. The scenario where it's a quick finale where the U.S. joins the fight and basically help Israel end the job. And so with this scenario in mind, what could be the response of Iran?
Yeah, I mean, and that's one of these scenarios where depends a lot on also how much the other damage to the political infrastructure. It obviously would be a big loss, sort of loss of face to some extent. Do they choose at that point to sign some sort of deal where the sort of their facilities are effectively sort of destroyed? I would see Iran wanting, even in that circumstance, real guarantees of sanctions relief and the like, and particularly there. But I would say that would be quite a, sort of quite a hit to the political, the political system. In theory, if it was done, and there was a pathway that the sort of threat, the nuclear threat, was diminished, then I would think the energy, sort of a number of the regional actors, even the GCC wouldn't be unhappy to see Iran's nuclear program put back. But the
So,
worry is, the
given the threat,
worry,
yeah, given the threat that we just heard today, right, from the regime, that if the US weren't to intervene, you need to know that we could lash out or like something like that. Do you think there are real concerns of what Iran could do? Would it be, do you think, addressed to the neighbors, oil and gas infrastructure in the neighborhood, in the Gulf, or to US assets and personnel in the region? Like, do it, that could be, I think, for me, one of the big risks.
yeah, I think that would be that would be a risk. I know that's one of the reasons that even as this particular operation was kicking off, the US starting its evacuation or partial evacuation of some of the military facilities. I mean, really only announced effectively the night before this started, so it's hard to tell how much had been materialized. And we've seen Iran at different times threaten both U.S. infrastructure, but and facilities and interests, as well as the energy assets of its neighbors. That hasn't been tested at this point. There's a still open question also of how much sort of the missile stockpiles and drones and other sort of other military equipment, how much of that has been utilized or damaged.
Yeah,
There are people who sort of track the energy, not the energy, the military response even closer than I, that would point or sort of raise the question of, is Iran and its responses to the different Israeli attacks, are we seeing fewer and fewer missiles as time goes on, and what that might signify? The other question in this scenario is, after, sort of in this scenario of Fordow and the like, would Israel stop there? What about the missile program? What about the sort of other question
right.
marks? But
Yeah.
yeah, so I mean, look, I
By
think
the way, in this scenario, I mean, for me, Israel is not really after regime change. They can talk about it. They have nothing to lose to talk about it, but that's not the end goal, because I think it requires an internal uprising. And I think that's also one of the reasons why they're not going to go after the Ayatollah right now, because he's already 86. He doesn't have a good succession in place. I mean, his son
no.
doesn't really have legitimacy. So it can only help over time crumbling the regime from within. We will never know how long it will take, like repressive regime like the Iranian regime, and we've seen in the past for other regime like this, it collapsed, but we never know exactly the timing of the collapse.
Well, not only not in the time of the collapse, but also you never know who's gonna be next. And a lot of times, I would say the history of regime change, particularly forced regime change, externally mandated regime change, the what comes next. I'm not saying it's as worse as before, but it's new issues. And I would recommend any kind of listener pick up Phil Gordon's book from a couple of years ago, maybe 5 years ago, about sort of the history of regime change in the Middle East. And it's sobering reading. And I think it highlights, the need for humility about, regime change policies. in that way. Now, again, and I think there clearly seems to my mind an interest from Israel's perspective of weakening the regime, of increasing, domestic, if it comes with domestic pressure on this. But as you say, goal is not sort of toppling. That's where I think some of this chatter of those near Trump about how Trump is going to pick a new leader of Iran is not particularly helpful, because sometimes certain types of threats on a regime, on a country, can actually lead to a rally round the flag impact, and the like. But yes, I think you're probably right.
So
The
actually,
goal is
on
not
the Trump,
regime change per se, but maybe a much weaker Iran that then sets up the motion of maybe domestic response, that they would take a different take a different course. But the risk, I think, in this scenario, especially when you've seen the generational change in parts of the military apparatus, infrastructure, is, could they move towards living with neighbors a little bit more, or do they go more hardline? And that's something, unfortunately, is hard to predict.
right. So on the Trump administration, it seems that there is also a debate, right? On
I
one
think so.
hand, the for the U.S. joining the fight would also restore potentially U.S. deterrence in the region. We have in mind the evacuation from Afghanistan. The Houthi are still threatening freedom of
Hmm.
navigation,
Yes.
and China is watching.
Yes.
And we know that China has its eyes on Taiwan, a blockade or whatever the scenario that they will put in place in Taiwan. But they are watching what the U.S. can do and the response from the Trump administration. So
Yeah.
that's on one hand. On the other hand, there is kind of the MAGA wing, right, that doesn't want to be involved in another war, would prefer returning to the nuclear talks and discussions. And so that's going to be very interesting to see
Hmm.
what's playing out. In terms of energy issues, and for me, the second scenario would be so the return of discussions. And then how long will it take? And what will Iran be able to concede or not? So the weakest they come to the negotiation table, the more the U.S. will have the upper hand, potentially to ask for the dismantlement of the program, basically, and that will guarantee also the regime survival, the Iranian regime survival, and kind of a save the face exit. And I guess that's the neighbors in the Gulf. That's the if I'm thinking about the UAE or Qatar, Saudi Arabia, that's maybe also the solution they
Their preferred
prefer.
outcome.
Yeah, because suddenly you will have like less risk around the Strait of Hormuz and any infrastructure hit, as long as the discussion continue.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, there's still the question mark, as you say, of what would Iran be willing to go to accept. Also, what would the U.S. be willing to give? And I don't mean just on sort of nuclear, whether it's that idea of the, say, regional consortium on nuclear fuel, which there's a lot of questions of how you set that up. But I'm sure from some U.S. officials' perspective, it kills a few birds with one stone, right? At a time where you have much more civilian nuclear cooperation between the US and some of the Gulf states, and desire for more of that. But I also think in part of any face saving agreement means that the US would have to be willing to do a certain amount of front loading, or might have to do a certain amount of front loading of some of the sanctions relief, or at least a pathway whereby there would actually be an upside economically. And that's not just on the energy side, allowing more investment, but also a lot of the sanctions have been much more difficult to get other goods in. Now, of course, Iran's policy choices on the nuclear front, but also how they manage the sanctions, how they protected the military, the IRGC, the increasing role of the IRGC in the economy frame the fact that, or shape the fact that most of the sanctions disproportionately affected the Iranian people.
So on this point,
But
Rachel, can you remind our listener the IRGC is mostly the one getting the revenues from the oil exports, correct?
quite
Benefits.
a sizable, sort of a sizable portion. It's hard to track exactly how
Yeah.
much.
And we know that the
There,
IRGC is also involved in some, plotting terrorist attacks abroad. I mean, we had some recent reports, from Germany and other places
Mhm.
where some plots have been foiled over the past few years. How do you see the sanction lifting, knowing that if the regime stays in place and we have the same, kind of terror group basically getting the revenues, how do you see that happening?
Yeah, and that might, and I think that leads me to a view that we might have a time buying nuclear, sort of a diplomatic period of time, um, but that it might be difficult coming to a lasting deal, right? I mean, one of the dynamics, even with the JCPOA, even the sort of biggest supporters of the JCPOA, really the JCPOA in sort of the last decade ago, very much focused on, okay, do a deal on the nuclear side. There's still all these other ways in which Iran is a source of instability in the region. And so you had a dynamic where some of the nuclear related sanctions were suspended, right, put on hold temporarily, but a lot of other sanctions remained in place. And so there's definitely a possibility that could happen again, which would limit the upside benefit. Now, maybe this is also a scenario where keeping some of the sanctions in place, suspending them to try to maintain leverage, might be something the U.S. would apply, but it's still a dynamic that you would almost need to see uh, a policy shift and policy changes within Iran, not just about the nuclear program, but also in these other areas. We've
Yeah.
definitely seen many of Iran's friends in the region be significantly weakened out of the many operations that you talked about at the start. But there still are sort of networks across the world that they're
Yeah.
supporting, and so I think it leads me to a circumstance that maybe scenario two, actually coming to a full, resolution is a tough one, but it could be more of a time buying, sort of operation,
So
which,
why would you give it a chance from the get-go, knowing that militarily and economically it's the best window of opportunity potentially to get rid of the Iranian nuclear program? You see what I mean? Like I feel that Israel went so far already, and we don't have any guarantees that the discussion will lead to anywhere. So why not keeping the momentum now, risking maybe more infrastructure hits, more disruptions, but at the same time, oil prices, correct me if I'm wrong, but are from historical standards, we're still
mhm,
at $76 per barrel, I mean, below 80.
yeah, yeah,
Not a few weeks ago, US shale producers were complaining that, oil prices were too low. Saudi
yeah.
Arabia was starting to see, well, our vision 2030, we need a higher oil price maybe. Like, so what do you think?
Yeah, so I mean, I think why not in that context? I mean, I think so you're saying the energy market, impacts of this scenario. So I mean, I think the challenge with scenario one is this, or from a political sort of perspective, and the trade-offs is, well, does it actually succeed? Is this sort of stockpile, destroyed? How far is the program set back? Does it put Iran on a path? Does that, if it's not fully destroyed, does it put Iran on a path that they weren't, if they were having the option of having a nuclear weapon and keeping that in play and with leverage, does it put them solidly on the path? I mean, that's always, I think, been the risk,
And what can they
in
do
in
out of
that context.
desperation? Like, what would they do out of desperation? Like,
Exactly. And that's where I think the regional actors in particular, and also actors in Europe and other sort of like that, alongside this diplomatic effort, we also have this timeline of what about snapback, right? Sort of playing out. And before, the Operation Lion, kind of kicked off, I was ready, sort of the end of last week to write a piece about, what does snapback look like? Snapback meaning the snapback of the, pre JCPOA sanctions at the UN level that the Europeans and others were looking to trigger after the censure motion at the International Atomic Energy Agency. In practice, my view on an economic side is that snapback coming into place wouldn't necessarily move the needle a lot on the energy side or the economic side, given the pervasiveness of U.S. sanctions and given Iran's use of the shadow fleet, their sort of dodgy underground channels in the financial markets. Um, but it would create an environment perhaps where third countries that are hedgers, whether it's intermediaries in the UAE, places like Indonesia and Malaysia, might be more wary of participating in this trade. But at the end of the day, China doesn't really admit that it's buying energy from Iran, at least in the public statements.
yeah.
So, this
So
is a different.
can you confirm that, so Iran, China is the largest buyer of sanctioned
Correct.
oil from Iran, correct?
Yes, it's
So,
almost the
yeah,
only buyer.
yeah,
Um, and I use, I mean, I think we operate at a time where, on the one hand, Iran and its buyers and its intermediaries are constantly innovating and finding ways of subterfuge to get the fuel to market. But it is a good thing that the advent of satellite technology and a lot of different data sources, including many of the things that Leslie, have really pioneered, especially on the gas side. But I rely on the sort of good work also on the oil side that people like Vortexa and Tanker Trackers and other people sort of compile. And so we're in this odd circumstance
so
of.
actually, you remember China had brokered this deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran.
Correct.
They have a vested interest in stability in the region. At the same time, I feel that right now they are watching from the side. um, they don't really have their say. Do you think they could, you know do something about it, and what? Or
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. China is very much on the sidelines. They've had a couple of pretty nondescript statements calling for de-escalation, not even going anywhere near as far as Iran's neighbors in the Gulf. Maybe understandably, given that they are so close and near, sort of near these risk scenarios. What could get China involved? That's where I think thinking about the scenario, whether it's blockage of, sort of anything that adds more friction to getting oil and gas out of the Gulf, out of the Strait of Hormuz. We can all come up with estimates of blocking the sort of choke point, actually keeping the Strait of Hormuz closed seems like a very sort of tall order to me. But there's a lot of.
what about the likelihood of Iran seizing tankers or crew?
Yeah.
Um, yeah,
Exactly what I was about to say. I think that sub scenario of, as you say, seizing or damaging, or just making there be more, sort of friction and difficulty getting in and getting out.
yeah.
Also,
I just saw
we're
that.
in a
I don't know if
circumstance where drones, right? Drones can do a lot of damage, as we've seen. So I think there's a lot of sort of different sort of risks that Iran or Iranian friends or others could do. So where could I see China eventually getting involved? If there, I mean, it's hard to see the U.S. and China together, sort of trying to patrol, these sort of sea lanes in this sort of state of the world. The U.S. and China, maybe still have a bit of a truce on the trade side, though. We'll see what's happening. But I could see China in that context. Would China get involved and provide military equipment? No, I really don't think so. I don't think they're necessarily being asked. I
So
think
actually,
China's interest.
yeah, my third scenario is Iran completely go rogue, and in this scenario, he's finding its rogue friend, right? Who can help exactly with weapons or alternative, right?
Yeah.
Way out.
But I don't think it has as many rogue friends these days. But I think you're right. It's a scenario to play out. And we've just talked about why China might not be that rogue friend. They're willing to buy the energy, but China, unlike a country like India that is just buying oil and gas on price and has been quite happy to for its imports from Russia to go from like 5% up to 40% in the last 2 years, right? Because the price was right, and the shadow fleet could survive. We really have China keeping diversification sort of a goal. Now, they're not really diversified geographically, right? Because so much of China's oil and to a lesser extent gas is coming from the Middle East, is coming from the different sides of the Persian Gulf or Arabian Gulf. But that context, and so another reason why China wouldn't really enter and support Iran too much is they don't want to undermine their relationships with the Gulf countries, as well as and so I would see China being focused more sort of, close, sort of close to home. Now that brings us to Russia though, right? In the rogue scenario, like, is there a circumstance where Russia could provide more support? My sense is Russia's focused on its own issues, not real, if anything. And you tell me what you think, but I think Russia has more of an interest in trying to emphasize its diplomatic bona fides and how it could maybe help broker deals, part of, as it's going on with the negotiations about Russia and Ukraine.
And I
But
don't think Russia wants another nuclear power in the world. I don't think they are favoring proliferation at all.
yeah,
So
yeah, I think you're right, and I think it's hard to think of many places that want another nuclear power. But you're right. I think
even the
you know
Europeans, what do you think of the reactions of the Europeans so far?
I think the Europeans are very much on the sidelines, maybe not quite as much as the Chinese, but I think the Europeans are very focused on what's going on in Russia. They're very focused on what's going on economically vis-a-vis China, and they're balancing. And so, we've had some statements. I think the Europeans are walking sort of a line of, reiterating, Israel's right to defend itself, sort of really still, calling, there was a shift several years ago, even before October 7th, right? Where I think the Europeans became, more and more worried about Iran's role on the nuclear program, but also because of these assassinations, and as well their concerns about human rights within Iran. So we had that shift, and Europe, even with the advent of the Trump administration, I mean, Europe is not standing there saying, well, if US sanctions tighten, we'll do trade with you, Iran. This is very different, I think, than where Europe was when Trump exited the JCPOA in his first administration.
Yeah,
Um,
and I think
so,
now we see also real time the damage of the missiles that Iran is doing in Israel right now, like how the long range ballistic missiles that are I guess we're about the same size, but like 8 times our size, right? Like the image you see, like when they destroy buildings, it's like massive, and they weight also like two
yeah.
elephants or more. So imagine those missiles with a nuclear head on them. I mean, I don't think and they could potentially reach also European cities, right? Given the
Yeah. Yeah, so I think where it leaves Europe is it leaves Europe supporting option two and trying to bring option two really into some more stable, sort of situation, right? And that's where I think their support of snapback and censure motions and the like, it moves a little bit more slowly than I think Israel would be comfortable with. But in that area, I mean, I think the only maybe plausible scenario where scenario two becomes more stable is one in which, whether it is on the side, maybe it's not massive, direct sanctions relief, but a space for some of the GCC countries or others to invest in Iran and try to create some positive, feedback, loops there, an upside for the population. Now, maybe, as I say, that doesn't necessarily happen without a meaningful policy shift and generational shift.
When you
But
say
and
invest,
it does sound like it's a Goldilocks scenario, but I'm sort
yeah,
of trying to play
well,
devil's
yeah.
or
But
the opposite.
when you say invest, would you see an investment in the oil and gas in Iran?
I mean, it's always been that odd sort of question mark of, do you invest in the same sector where you would be where it's a competitor, right? Iran and the GCC countries very much competitors. Would see some element. I would anticipate it might be in the non-oil sector, even though as well. Look, on some of the non-oil sector, there has long been this sort of question, Iran, if we look back 10, 15 years ago, had much more robust manufacturing sector. It was, sort of at a lower price point and quality point than competitors in Asia and elsewhere. But compared to the Gulf, that's basically been trying to create those sectors. But some of it, the Gulf countries have been known to invest in neighboring countries for, well, they want some economic returns, but also for regional stability reasons. And I'm thinking about some of the investments in Egypt, for example, and other things like that. So, at this point where the sanctions are, but also the other issues in place, this is not a scenario that can come to pass. But if I'm thinking about when, I feel like these days especially spend a lot of time thinking about what are the different worst case scenarios. So it's useful also, even if it's super optimistic, to spend a little time thinking of what's the most plausible upside scenario or stable scenario. And regional investment is part of that story, but I think there is a lot of things that have to happen between now and then
Totally. Yeah.
to get there.
Yeah, I've
And
not
I
considered it actually without regime change, but at least on the oil and gas sector. Um, but were you surprised by the market reactions, like the oil and gas market reaction and pricing so far? Because I mean, we've seen restrained hits on the energy play, and traders seem to still maybe underestimate any potential big hit. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think markets are still in this show me the outage mode, right? And, which has been the story for some years. I think that is partly because the underlying macro dynamics in the for energy demand have been weaker. I shouldn't say
But
energy demand. Let's say
that's the
oil
same.
demand.
But that's the same on the gas side. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I think where, as you say, gas has had these sort of periods of time where the disruption and distortion of, or correct me if I'm wrong, but of the Russian supplies coming offline, and then the sort of dynamics. But I think there's a lot of buyers out there, like India, who, are really price sensitive on natural gas. The price is not at a point. But yeah, on the oil side. So I think that demand picture, is an issue. I think this element where people have is this line of, does it avoid being sort of regionalized? So what I've been thinking about is having to map these sort of different scenarios. One is a scenario where a meaningful amount of Iran's oil exports are off the market, and the other one is one where you start to think about difficulty getting some of the GCC oil to market. And what I've been thinking about more recently, is how oil loss from, say, a hit to Karg Island, which would be a big escalate. Karg Island is Iran's major export facility. They're building an alternate one, but I think it's not ready yet. Um, and how that's different, say, from a sanctions related production decline. It's a little bit of a moot point because the US, either from willingness and ability, has not been able to take much Iranian oil offline. If anything, Iranian oil exports in the last couple of months are sort of near their, recent, sort of recent highs, sort of back to where
Do
they.
you think the enforcement of sanctions from the US side has declined because of lack of resources or motivation or both?
I think it's a bit of that. I also think it's a lot harder to do meaningful enforcement now that Iran and its Chinese buyers are avoiding the use of US dollars, avoiding the use of G10 financial equipment and insurance. If you look at the sort of sanctions that came into place early or in the Obama administration before that round of nuclear talks, before that, they used Western financial infrastructure, Western tankers. And so it was a lot easier to sort of use a financial choke point and say, global banks, you have secondary sanctions against you if you touch anyone who touches Iranian oil. And now they haven't fully sanctioned proof in my view, but they've done a lot. So I think there are I think there's clear evidence in my mind that in the Biden administration, there was a period of time before October 7th where the willingness to enforce was weaker and new loopholes materialized. And then after October 7th, and they had more willingness to enforce, but they really just went after IRGC entities that were supporting the Houthis or Hamas or Hezbollah. They didn't go after overarching ones. And so I think now we're in a circumstance where the willingness is a little bit greater, but there are capacity constraints. OFAC and which is the sanctions enforcement body, and the folks at the State Department are also facing losses of personnel and the like, the sort of fiscal and other cuts.
Budget cuts, yeah.
Yeah. And loss of experienced people who've been doing these targeting, but I still think there's also a reluctance in the U.S. to go after these big Chinese end users, to go after a Chinese bank involved in that area. And so I tend to think it's a mixture of ability and willingness.
Yeah.
And,
And
at
for
times.
our listeners, what's the amount of dependence of China on the Iranian oil or Middle East oil?
So Middle East oil, very, quite high, well over, sort of well over 50, well over 50% for Iran. You're talking about, 15, percent or so. It ebbs and flows a little bit. It's definitely some of the cheapest oil that China is buying. Um, but of course, China is a sizable buyer also of Russian oil, and the sanctions enforcement right now on Venezuela means that China is actually also able to pick up some of that oil. It's a
So
different crude
yeah.
blend.
So in your two scenario, either Iran out or both Iran plus the GCC, are there any alternative oil producers that can pick up and you'll be in a sustainable, I mean, temporary, but can China sustain this or not?
Yeah, so I think some of it depends on whether there is also a hit to GCC supplies, right? I mean, I think that's really a global kind of question mark. In the scenario where Iran's output goes down noticeably because of sanctions, there was always the risk that Iran might lash out in some way. But I think if it's because of a sort of military escalation and attack, the risk to neighboring infrastructure is great. And the only part of the world that has a lot of spare capacity ready to go online in short periods of time is among Iran's neighbors. And so if there is friction getting those supplies out, there aren't a lot of other producers who quickly can ramp up. Now, I've heard sort of talk that in the short term, if Iran's not selling as much to China, maybe, there is some extra supplies in Nigeria. We talked earlier about, what about the shale producers? Now, they can't necessarily get oil quickly online and start drilling in a couple of months, but over the course of a year or so, if they felt more confident about the price and demand outlook, they could. We have been seeing the U.S. producers cut back on production. Some of them, if they were smart, they might well have hedged out their production and locked in some higher prices. That may partly explain some of the shape of the curve. I mean, we'll wait to see. But I think the issue is, it depends why they're having to, why China would be having to replace supplies. And of course,
By
this
the way,
price environment is good for Russia as
yeah,
well,
yeah.
right?
On the LNG side, China is dependent on like 25% from Qatari LNG.
Mm, yeah.
But I don't think Iran would strike Qatar. I mean, they have a pretty cordial relationship. They share this gas field that we mentioned earlier, and they have a deeper cooperation that I think the public is aware of, because
Mm,
of the expansion of the Qatari field. That said, Qatar is dependent on evacuating its LNG cargoes out of the Strait of Hormuz. And if there were any disruption or slowdown of transit through the Strait of Hormuz, that would, that's impacting Qatar. Um, and, we've seen a lot of jamming and spoofing and tankers already hiding their exact geolocation, and we've seen that it can lead to collision. I mean, we're definitely going
yeah.
to see, I think, a slowdown in exports, and we have already seen that a little bit. So yeah, there is clearly an impact for all the players here, and it seems that it will keep going for a couple of days or weeks. So we'll keep following this, Rachel, and thank
Yeah.
you for joining the podcast. Again, it was on kind of last minute, less prepared, and more off the cuff, but I think it was an interesting conversation to have.
Yeah, very, very interesting for me. And I think continuing to track, particularly across the energy space, how this is affecting will be really important. How these slowdowns and the development of almost just-in-time loading, and producers thinking, and those in the supply chain thinking about where to keep their infrastructure. Will we start to see traffic jams, sort of in some of the oceans? As you say, Iran's use of spoofing technologies and other things going on, Russia's use of spoofing technologies elsewhere. And this is all coming at the time where it's only unilateral policies, but we have the Europeans trying to kind of step up enforcement of the shadow fleet. We have a lot of different things in play. And so maybe it's not just about thinking about outright sort of worst case scenarios, but yeah, thinking about what happens if things sort of slow down a bit, these sort of different kind of supply chain frictions in this space. And that's where I think we're going to be focusing a lot more on, also what countries have been filling up their stockpiles and which ones are forced to fill them up at somewhat higher prices. And I'm particularly watching China.
Oh yeah, and if Iran remains a permanent rock state, or a permanent threat for a longer period of time, I think some buyers of the Gulf countries and will have to reconsider their, strategically, their suppliers, right? And think even more diversification of suppliers and routes,
Mhm.
because maritime routes are a big choke points right now in the region.
Yeah, no, no, exactly. And I look forward to in the future talking with you about what some of that diversification looks like, and locking up, and I'm sure even contracts sort of shifting and people looking for more flexibility. But I know we could keep talking for hours, but
Well,
till the next time.
yes, thank you, Rachel. This is Leslie Palti-Guzman saying good day and good luck. This episode was recorded on June 18, 2025.